listeners to Snippit Sports Science Podcast, sponsored by EliteForm.com and supported by listeners like you on the crowdfunding platform Patreon. If you've been enjoying our podcast, please consider supporting us on patreon.com/snippetscience. Your support helps this podcast keep going and helps us improve our audio quality and offer new and improved material. So I'm your host, Jared Coleman-Stark, for the coffee themed series that we have going on now. This is going to be part 2, or really it's sort of part 3 actually, because in Snippet 35, Chris interviewed Olympian Craig Pickering on 2 of the papers that he had there. So I really encourage you to go have a listen of Snippet 35 at some point. It can fit in at pretty much any point in this theme. They discussed 2 of his articles. First one was, what should we do about habitual caffeine use in athletes? And Craig's second article was, are the current guidelines on caffeine use in sport optimal for everyone? Inter-individual variation in caffeine ergogenicity and a move towards personalized sports nutrition. And they also discuss Craig's personal experience using caffeine as an Olympian, as well as the other research that he's done in it, and his work with DNA Fit, which is working towards more personalized sports nutrition, as implied by one of Craig's articles there. So today's article is going to be another umbrella review that we're going to pit against the first review. This one is called Coffee Consumption and Health, Umbrella Review of Meta-analyses of Multiple Health Outcomes by Poole and colleagues. So this umbrella review, similar to the previous one, looked at 201 meta-analyses of observational studies with 67 unique outcomes, as well as 17 meta-analyses of interventional research with 9 unique outcomes. What they found was, overall, coffee consumption was more often associated with benefit than harm. This included really interesting subgroup analyses, such as high consumption versus low consumption, any coffee consumption versus no coffee consumption at all, as well as a third analysis that looked at 1 extra cup a day. So if you were comparing how you are right now versus if you were to have just 1 more cup of coffee, how would that affect your health? And what they found was that for all those categories, the greater consumption of coffee in each of those subgroup analyses was associated with more benefit than harm. These were primarily nonlinear associations, with summary estimates indicating the largest relative risk reduction at intakes of 3 to 4 cups a day versus none. So that's a little bit of a differentiation between this umbrella review and the previous one, is the previous one declared that 4 to 5 cups per day was best, whereas this one is now concluding that 3 to 4 cups of coffee a day is best. And I mean, if we split the difference here, they both include 4, right? So overall, I would assume that 4 would be a sort of magic number that we have here, with one umbrella review suggesting 4 to 5, and this one now suggesting 3 to 4. At 3 to 4 cups a day versus none, these researchers found summary estimates indicating largest relative risk reduction for all-cause mortality at 0.83. So that's a 17% relative risk decrease versus consuming no coffee. Then for cardiovascular mortality, they found a relative risk of 0.81, and for cardiovascular disease, a relative risk of 0.85. And the widest 95% confidence interval here was for that cardiovascular mortality, with a 95% confidence interval from 0.72 to 0.90, quite significant. When looking at high versus low coffee consumption, the researchers found that high consumption was associated with 0.82 relative risk of incident cancer. Consumption was also associated with lower risk of specific cancers and neurological, metabolic, and liver conditions. Harmful associations were largely nullified by adequate adjustment for smoking, similar to what we saw in the previous umbrella review, where we looked at those lung and gastric cancers that were confounded by smoking. In this study, they found that high versus low or no consumption was associated with harmful pregnancy outcomes, similar to the previous umbrella review. They went into a little bit more depth here, writing that low birth weight had an odds ratio of 1.31, so quite greater odds for low birth weight, as well as preterm birth in the first and second trimesters. and those odds ratios were 1.22 and 1.12 respectively. There was also an increased risk of pregnancy loss with an odds ratio of 1.46. That looks like our biggest one there, and that's quite noticeable. A final adverse outcome was that there was an association between coffee drinking and risk of fracture. This was observed in women, but not in men. Overall, coffee drinking seems safe within usual patterns of consumption, except during pregnancy and in women at increased risk of fracture. Existing evidence is observational and of what scientists would consider lower quality, and randomized controlled trials are needed. So even though that we are saying that scientifically these are regarded as lower quality, as far as all body of evidence goes, we're talking about an umbrella review that's looked at 201 meta-analyses of observational studies and 17 meta-analyses of interventional research. So overall, that's nearly as high a level of evidence that we really get. That's just about the most data you could ever see for any particular intervention. The researchers do note here that a future randomized controlled trial in which the intervention is increasing coffee consumption would be unlikely to result in significant harm to participants. So they're really green-lighting additional research to be done. As research suggests that something is safe, we're able to research it more. And it's much easier to get cleared by an ethics board if you have this sort of support for your research. They've done an interesting assessment here in Figure 2, looking at high versus low coffee consumption and associations with multiple health outcomes. So they split this into two groups of the 10 outcomes that coffee is most harmful for and the 10 outcomes that coffee is most beneficial for. So just reading through these quickly, the 10 most harmful are oral cleft malformation, 3rd trimester preterm birth, 1st trimester preterm birth, laryngeal cancer, lymphoma, low birth weight, rheumatoid arthritis, pregnancy loss, lung cancer, and acute leukemia in childhood, with the greatest risk estimate there being 1.57 for acute leukemia in childhood. And so you saw a lot of those were pregnancy related, and that's consistent with the summary that we've previously gone through. Now looking at the 10 most beneficial, we see type 2 diabetes, oral cancer, cirrhosis, renal stones, Parkinson's disease, leukemia, post-myocardial infarction mortality, gout, liver cancer, and chronic liver disease, with the risk estimate for chronic liver disease being 0.35. That's a 65% reduction in risk estimate favoring coffee over no coffee. Similar most harmful versus most beneficial outcomes were observed for any versus none and 1 extra cup of coffee per day as the high versus low coffee consumption subgroups. Moving down to Figure 5, looking at consumption of decaffeinated coffee and associations with multiple health outcomes, we see that for most of the outcomes listed in this figure, the decaffeinated coffee is also more favorable. So it's not just the caffeine in coffee, there's something else in the coffee that is causing these favorable outcomes. Looking at the maximum consumption of coffee in a nonlinear dose response analysis, so basically the most amount of coffee that anyone is consuming, they found that for cancer mortality, the risk is approximately equal to consuming no coffee. And for all-cause mortality, the risk is 0.90. For cardiovascular mortality, the risk is 0.86. So even at the most coffee that anyone is consuming, in any of the studies looked at, most of the risks are reduced in even the highest level of consumption of coffee versus drinking low or no coffee whatsoever. Continuing on into Figure 7, covering coffee consumption in randomized controlled trials. So moving on from those observational studies onto the randomized controlled trials, we're looking specifically at filtered versus unfiltered and caffeinated versus decaffeinated. And they find that looking at those cholesterol measures, one of the concerns that we might have, because cholesterol is one of the things that does favor no coffee rather than favoring coffee. However, what it's found is that if you look at the summary mean difference for filtered coffee versus unfiltered coffee, the cholesterol risk is much more in that unfiltered coffee, which I presume most of our listeners wouldn't really be drinking. Everyone is drinking much more filtered coffee, and for the filtered coffee, the majority of those 95% confidence intervals are crossing over the 0 line, and so it's not significant statistically whether it favors no coffee or coffee, although even for filtered coffee, it's still leaning towards no coffee. Then looking at caffeinated versus decaffeinated, there do overall appear to be higher numbers for the risk of caffeinated coffee to total cholesterol, LDL, and triglycerides, with again that decaffeinated coffee appears much more likely to be not statistically significant, having lower summary means as there, the 95% confidence intervals crossing over that 0 line. And so that risk to the cholesterol is potentially due to the caffeine per se, or possibly those diterpenes, which were noted previously to affect cholesterol from the unfiltered coffee. So certainly if you're quite concerned about your cholesterol, I imagine if you're drinking filtered decaffeinated coffee, that can still be quite beneficial for your health. The authors of this umbrella review, Poole and colleagues, then go on to compare their results to the most recent analysis, which was authored by Grosso and colleagues, the same authors who wrote the previous umbrella review, so they sort of directly compare their results to some of the works done by the previous research group that we looked at, and they write that in Grosso's most recent meta-analysis, the higher exposure category, which was 7 cups of coffee a day, of a non-linear dose-response analysis, was associated with 10% lower risk of all-cause mortality. That's a relative risk of 0.9 with a 95% confidence interval from 0.85 to 0.96. The summary estimates indicated that the largest reduction in relative risk was associated with consumption of 3 cups a day compared to no consumption. The relative risk for 3 cups a day was 0.83. However, 1 extra cup a day was associated with 4% lower risk of all-cause mortality. It's a relative risk 0.96, each additional 1 extra cup a day. And so when in doubt, have 1 extra cup. Finally, high versus low intake of decaffeinated coffee was also associated with lower all-cause mortality, with summary estimates indicating largest benefit at, again, 3 cups a day, with a relative risk of 0.83, similar to caffeinated coffee. Considering metabolic disease, it was found that there was a lower risk for type 2 diabetes or high versus consumption, with a relative risk of 0.7, and for 1 extra cup a day, with a relative risk of 0.94. Some evidence for a non-linear dose response, but the risk was still lower for each dose of increased consumption between 1 and 6 cups. That's up to 6 cups we're seeing decreased relative risk for metabolic disease. Decaffeinated coffee also seems to have similar associations of comparable magnitude. For metabolic syndrome, high versus low coffee consumption was associated with 9% lower risk. That's a relative risk of 0.91. High versus low consumption was also significantly associated with a lower risk of renal stones and gout. Considering the method of preparation, instant and filtered coffee contain negligible amounts of diterpenes compared with espresso, with even higher amounts in boiled coffee. The effect of filtered coffee consumption on lipids was negligible or failed to reach significance compared with unfiltered coffee. Dose of diterpenes needed to cause hypercholesterolemia is likely to be much higher than the dose needed for beneficial anti-carcinogenic effects. For unfiltered coffee, the clinical relevance of such small increases in total cholesterol, low-density lipoprotein cholesterol, and triglyceride due to coffee are difficult to extrapolate, especially as coffee consumption does not seem to be associated with adverse cardiovascular outcomes, including mortality after myocardial infarction. Changes in the lipid profile associated with coffee are also reversed with abstinence. When dose-response analyses have been conducted and when these have suggested non-linearity, for example in all-cause mortality, cardiovascular disease mortality, cardiovascular disease, and heart failure, summary estimates indicate that the largest relative risk reduction is associated with intakes of 3 to 4 cups a day. Importantly, increase in consumption beyond this intake does not seem to be associated with increased risk of harm. Rather, the magnitude of the benefit is reduced. In type 2 diabetes, despite significant nonlinearity, relative risk reduced sequentially from 1 through to 6 cups a day. Estimates from higher intakes are likely to include a smaller number of participants and this could be reflected in the imprecision observed for some outcomes at these levels of consumption. There are particularly beneficial associations between coffee consumption and liver outcomes. We saw those were some of the largest summary estimates. These liver outcomes include fibrosis, cirrhosis, chronic liver disease, and liver cancer. These were relatively large and consistent effect sizes compared with the other outcomes. Consumption is also beneficially associated with a range of other health outcomes. And coffee does not seem to have definitive harmful associations with any outcomes outside of pregnancy. Association between consumption and risk of fracture in women remains uncertain, but warrants further investigation. It's been found that caffeine intake of 400 milligrams per day, about 4 or 5 cups of coffee, was not associated with adverse effects on the risk of fracture, falls, bone mineral density, or calcium metabolism. However, pregnancy, risk of pregnancy, and women with higher risk of fracture would be justified exclusion criteria for a coffee treatment study. This is where we're moving a lot with the researches that we're establishing that coffee intervention is particularly safe for most research, and very clear exclusion criteria would be for pregnancy and women with a higher risk of fracture. So I hope you enjoyed this second umbrella review. I think it's very interesting to have these two dueling groups of researchers, both having completed umbrella reviews at relatively similar times and finding quite similar findings, but of course slightly different approaches to the problem. I hope it's been interesting for you to compare the two of them. And if you've been enjoying the podcast, please consider helping to support us on patreon.com/snippetscience or visit our sponsor at eliteform.com. Tune in for the next part of the series where we'll be going into a bit more of that individualization for, okay, we have these giant umbrella reviews that coffee is affecting the general population in a particular way, but what about individual differences? Tune in next time. Thank you.